Okay, let's see how this goes. Hi Vitor, or Victor. It's great to be participating in your MA series. So I'm Nick Zangwill, and I want to say a few things about the theory of art, or the theory of the essence, or the definition of art, because it's a sort of kind of standard thing to talk about in analytic aesthetics. But sometimes you think, why do things get stuck as being the things to talk about? So I want to talk briefly about how things were for a long time, and then say where I think we should go in thinking about these kind of issues. Okay, so what people did for a lot of the 20th century is a lot of the latter half of the 20th century, is they tried to do something called defining art, right? And you'll find a lot of the efforts summed up in, I shouldn't be touching my face in this COVID times, summed up in Stephen Davis's book Defining Art. And there are lots of anthologies. They typically have a section on defining art. And we need a definition of defining. What is it to define something? Well, when they talk about it, it's normally in terms of giving necessary and sufficient conditions for art, and that's really the staple diet of a lot of analytic, aesthetic, general philosophy of art in the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. I think it's a bit odd and a bit weird thing to be doing. I mean, why? Why were they trying to do that? What for? So here's an easy way of answering that question. It just shows that it can't ever have been a goal worth aiming it for. Look, necessarily something's art if and only God would think it's art. Or necessarily something's art if it's a member of the set of things which are art. Now, those both give necessary and sufficient conditions for art, but they're utterly useless, utterly lacking in any kind of interest, and give no understanding whatsoever. So it's really, if you think about that, I mean, it's just, even if you can answer the question, that's not what we're really aiming at, just necessary and sufficient conditions. But a lot of if you read that stuff, going way back to the, late 50s, early 60s, and all the stuff that's come since then, all the people writing about that, they all assume this goal of necessary and sufficient conditions, when actually that's not a goal anyone should have been aiming at. What's probably was going on was that these people were trying to imitate or simulate or do something similar to what was going on in epistemology, where people were trying to define knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, the Gettier industry and what came after that. That was also a really bad idea. Necessarily something's knowledge if and only God would think it's knowledge, or if it's a member of the set of things which are knowledge. They're both necessary and sufficient conditions for being knowledge, but utterly useless, give no understanding, because they don't really speak to the essence or the nature of the thing we're interested in. And I suppose here I'm just picking up on a lot of things that have happened in general metaphysics with Kit Fine and his work after that modality, necessary and sufficient conditions, is just a really bad way, or an insufficient way, to get at what you really are after when you're after the essence or nature of something. Okay, so you might say, whatever. You can diss something, you can be negative, but there's an alternative. There's an alternative. We can put something in its place. Now, maybe the best way to get there, again, is from a wrong place, is to think, well, what we're interested in is the concept of art. The concept of art, right? And that's a concept which the one in philosophical aesthetics is very much of that 18th century one, which spans what's called the modern system of the arts. So it includes music, poetry, sculpture, painting, and architecture. And we're supposed to be trying to get at that concept, and that's why I think people in that tradition were trying to give necessary and sufficient conditions. They thought that that's how you get at concepts. And as we've seen, that's a really bad idea. It's a really bad thing to do for all sorts of reasons. But what's the alternative? And what I think the alternative is we're looking for some kind of general explanation. So that's, I think, so let me put something in the place of that project, which I think isn't a good one. Okay, so the general issue, so there's the explanationist versus the necessary and sufficientist, if you want labels to go with these options. Now, okay, so there's a sort of meta question. We're doing the general theory of art, and you might think, well, how do we know when we're doing well at that? How do we know when we're doing better or worse, when we got a good theory? Really, these meta questions are prior to really getting involved in stuck into the theory of any particular theory. I like to say one of my slogans is "the meta, the better." So quite often you need to ascend and look down at yourself and see what you're doing in philosophy and see, well, why am I doing that? Or, what if someone did it completely differently? Didn't like the rules of the game we're playing. So I think at least there's a debate here. And if, you carry nothing else away from this lecture, I'd say, look, let's get into a debate about what a good theory of art would look like, what we'd want from it. So I think one good piece of writing here to go to is a not very well-known paper by Thomas Kuhn, who's famous for his Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Now, he wrote a paper after that called, in 1974, Objectivity, Value Judgment and Theory Choice. And what he does, and really it's worth reading if you think you know who Kuhn was and what he said in the famous book, because his view is actually better and more sensible than the sort of relativist postmodern nonsense that most people have taken it to be. It's actually, more interesting. So he lists these criteria of adequacy for a theory choice generally. He's thinking about scientific theories: accuracy, consistency, scope, simplicity, and fruitfulness. Okay. So he protests about the critics of his first book, and what he's really doing is in the book, or what's interesting in the book, was endorsing a kind of pluralism about what counts as a good theory. How do you know when you've got a good theory? Well, one is covering all the data. That's just one good thing, and the other one, there are various other things we might want from a theory. And the point was, the sort of non-rationalist point, if you like, was that came out of it was that sometimes you're in a dilemma in theory choice. You're stuck at a certain point of history. You're having to make a choice about which theory to accept. But it could be that there's just no, clear answer, because both sides have got a lot to be said for them. Both sides, and so you're in epistemology, something rather like what you have in tragedy, in Greek tragedy, in all the which is made a great deal of more recently by Bernard Williams, that there can be two things. You're in a dilemma, and really there's a good reason for both the things you should be doing, but there's no clear right answer as to this is what you should do. And ordinary life is full of moral dilemmas where it's not clear what we should do. If you do one thing, you have to sacrifice another, which is a great loss. Similarly in epistemology, and I think that's really what is going on. This is as Thomas Kuhn sees things. And my view is that that's really should be the situation in the philosophy of art, that somehow we've got these different things we might want from the theory, but sometimes there is a plurality of goods that they don't all fit together. So if you've got one which is good in one way, it's good in another. So what I'm going to do here is focus on these two desiderata that you might want. two things you might want from a theory. One which is fitting all the cases, and that's what you might call, in Tarski's word, extensional adequacy. And the other is an explanatory goal. Okay, and one theory might do better than another at explanation, but not do so well at covering all the data. Okay, so I think that the quest for extensional adequacy was what dominated post-war general theory of art. They just wanted to get a theory which fitted an intuitive extension of the notion of art, or the one that they had, their notion of art, and fitted that intuitive extension. But I think that this explanation is more important and really should dominate extensional adequacy if there's a dilemma and we need to choose. So that's how I want to start off now. I want to start by casting doubt on the extensional methodology and defending the explanatory methodology. And we'll see how that goes. Okay, continue in just a moment. Okay, let's get a bit stuck into some details. One thing that's loomed large, too large, is an interest in the concept of art. And as soon as this takes center stage, you then have an emphasis on intuitions that people have about which things fall under the concept. And this was really taken to be important in really bringing out the data, which is part of a theory, giving necessary and sufficient conditions. So then intuitions play this sort of evidential role as data in this kind of theorizing. I think this is dodgy, dubious. I don't like the role that intuitions are playing here. Firstly, intuitions really do vary quite a bit among theorists. Different people who hold different theories surprisingly have very different intuitions about cases. Are doodles works of art, blah blah blah, and then what then when you get a standoff? What do? Whose intuitions are kind of authoritative in this situation? And secondly, there's 3 points here. Secondly, why do intuitions have any evidential status? I mean, look, we're interested in a phenomenon in the world, say fish, and then you've got intuitions about what's a fish. Well, I mean, is a whale a fish? What's your intuition? It just seems like the wrong kind of question. I mean, we're not interested in staring at our conceptual navels. So that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in the fish or the artworks and trying to understand them. We're interested in metaphysical things, if you like, questions about the world and their nature and essence. What have our conceptual belly buttons got to do with that? So the issue is not what concepts do we have. It should be which ones should we have in order to grasp and understand this phenomenon. So that's why I think people think, experimental aesthetics is tremendously exciting. No, it's just perpetuating the same old mistake of thinking that it's our concepts that matter, and then they're giving us a sort of allegedly scientific investigation into which concepts we have, although psychologists find almost all experimental aesthetics and experimental philosophy quite comic if you talk to them, and when you look at the scientific credibility of what's actually done. Put that to one side. It just seems like our concepts is just at best it's an incredibly indirect path to what we're really interested in, which is a certain subject matter. The third point, though, is particular to the notion of art, which is not really clear that we do have such a notion. In English, it's what typically happens is you teach undergraduates that we have this general notion of art spanning poetry, music, and architecture, and literature, and painting, and then they grasp it, and then we ask them to analyze it. It's just a sort of slightly bizarre enterprise. In German, there's this notion of Kunst, but I think, in lots of languages there just is no general notion of art that we're trying to investigate. It's a kind of construction of philosophical aesthetics. So it's all a bit of a farce, really. We teach them, then they ask them to analyse it. Okay. So there's something in the idea of those people like Dominic Lopez who say, well, let's focus on the traditional art forms. Except when he gets to those traditional art forms, he just wants to analyse them by producing necessary and sufficient conditions. So he's, in a sense, there's something into backing off from the general notion of looking at specific art form notions, but let's not get stuck back into necessary and sufficient conditions game, as we saw earlier on. Okay, but how did this play out? Let's go back into, for me, rather boring stuff. But so then you have the role of the avant-garde in all this, and it's just so tedious in the textbooks. So you have these traditional aesthetic notions of art with which I'm sympathetic. One of my great regrets is I never met Monroe Beardsley. I'd love to meet him, so I've carried the flag for him to some extent. There's a lot in general aesthetic theory of art, which is a theory which gives the aesthetic functions of things some kind of dominant role. And then there's supposed to be counter-examples to them. We love counter-examples. And, if you read the textbooks, so many textbooks say they refute the aesthetic theories of art. It's just a joke. It's a sort of bedtime story, but it's just, what happy simplicity. How it's embarrassingly simple. The interpretation of avant-garde works, for a start, is dodgy, dubious, but also there's a huge number of different ways aesthetic theories can respond. For example, they could take these cases to be second-order works. So they're commenting on aesthetic works, and then the aesthetic sneaks in that way. There's lots of things for them to say. So, why the textbooks repeat this painful, boring platitude that it's a kind of refutation, I've got no idea. Maybe that's what the textbook writers were taught in graduate school. I don't know. Sorry, I'm being a bit bitchy. But anyway, even if it was true, so you've got a general theory, and then some cases don't fit. So, okay, whatever. It's just still true of the cases that it fits. Why do we need to have this complete generality of application? If you've got an explanatory theory which fits a whole lot of cases, who cares if there are some cases that it doesn't fit? Maybe in that case it's just like a dilemma, to go back to the Kuhn point. So there's a bit of sacrifice in some cases for a greater explanatory scope elsewhere. I think that's really I just want to say that, because people doing aesthetic theories of art, people doing theories of art are constantly faced with this, the refutation of the avant-garde syndrome. And it's just really strange that it's had such dominance. I suppose people like the idea of refutations of theories, but when was life ever that simple? Back to Kuhn, theoretical life was not that simple in the sciences, and it's not that simple in philosophy. Okay, but let's try and be... Sorry, I've been a bit negative in what I've said so far, but let's get onto some more positive material about the way I think is the way to go. And I like to emphasize... sorry, some guy with a dog's come in. I like to emphasize rational explanation. So we need a theory which explains a whole bunch of phenomena and a whole bunch of art activities, which makes those activities intelligible, makes them make sense, makes them seem totally unweird, and it makes the practitioners reasonable for pursuing those activities and engaging in those, as it were, artistic forms of life. Okay, so you need some kind of, you might aspire to some kind of quite general theory covering many of the arts. Why not? And that's what we're after, some kind of explanation, which is quite general. Which is, so we want to know why people are spending time and activity pursuing these things. Okay. It's the guy with the dog shouting. Okay. Okay. So since we're looking at explanation, and aesthetic theory is really in a very good place because it's appealing to pleasure, and of course a very special kind of pleasure, and a huge amount of work in philosophy has gone into specifying the kind of pleasure involved in appreciation of beauty and other aesthetic properties. People like Hume and Kant and others have, elucidated the particular value and the particular nature of aesthetic pleasure, that is, pleasure in beauty. And then the point of an aesthetic theory of art is to give that the aesthetic dimension, make that into the function of many artworks, a whole lot of them. Who cares about, some strange ones? And then that gives you some kind of way of understanding what practitioners of those artworks, people who are consuming and making those things, see in it, get out of it, right? So it's intelligible. And a whole lot of theories of art, which are not aesthetic theories of art, all sorts of other theories of art, don't have the beginnings of any such explanation. So that's a big bonus for the aesthetic theory. I'm not saying that other theories can't also have such rational explanations up their sleeve, but that's an aesthetic theory's got that going for it, and partly it's got that going for it because it builds in a kind of value into the theory. So it's a kind of, beauty is a kind of value, and we're sensible for valuing values, of course, and then it makes sense that we're, those values are ones which we take seriously and pursue. So we're reasonable people, and you can get inside the head of someone who's engaging with artworks, as either producing them or consuming them, to see why they might do that. Okay, so that makes rational explanation, gives you a kind of rational explanation of the artworks. Now someone might say, well, okay, we'll grant you that, so here's a reply, if you like, on behalf of the concept person. They'll say, yeah, grant me that, and then say, no one's actually ever said this, but I'm imagining that someone might say this, which is they might say, well, yeah, that's true, but that's why we need the concept of art to play a role, because it's figuring not in the lives of the theorist who's speculating about the nature of these phenomena, but it's figuring in the mental life of the people that are producing and consuming art. They're producing and consuming it under the concept of art. So then, in order to engage in this kind of rational activity, we need to know what the concept of art is. So I take that to be quite serious, a serious point. I don't know anyone who's made it, but it seems that's a way to sort of sneak the concept back into the center of the theory in another place. I wonder if that's right. I'm wondering if a lot of it, how many art activities do involve functioning, thinking under the guise of art in that way. I'm wondering if some, you think of peasants wood carving or whatever. They're just carving the wood and aiming to make some beautiful carving. Children's art. I think children's art is art. Would be weird to deny that. I don't think they're that sophisticated. So they could be aiming at various goals to make something attractive. There's a dog coming here. Hello, Julius. There's a dog. Hello. Hello. Welcome to my video. So, there's a dog suddenly appeared. Anyway, so yeah. Where was I? The concept of art. So I think it might be true that if you're looking at some very sophisticated art, that is people engaging in that in a very self-reflective way in the high art worlds of, New York and London and Tokyo, wherever. They are deploying that kind of sophisticated notion of art and wanting us to maybe even to engage in our reflection and think of those works as artworks in the relevant way. Perhaps that's true, but I'm not sure why we should see those kind of art activities as central when a whole lot of art is Sunday painting, is not that sophisticated. So why make the sophisticated cases, who of course, as sophisticated philosophers, our friends probably are engaging in those kind of artworks. Our artistic friends are doing that. They're very sophisticated. We're very sophisticated, but it just would be a sort of failure of point of view to think that most art is like that. I think a hell of a lot isn't. But it is true. But even in those cases, okay, grant that if you're trying to understand that sort of sophisticated art, so you need to have a notion of art which is figuring in the heads of the people producing and consuming that sophisticated art. It's not the concepts of the theorist that's being analysed there. It's the concepts of the practitioners which is important. So it's quite different from the traditional sort of conceptual analysis philosophy, where we want to understand something over there, and so we analyse our concept as theorists with our pipes in the common room over here. No, it's a completely different way that the concept is functioning even there. Okay, now one thing to notice about this is that this evaluation is going to play a central notion in the notion of in theorizing about art, because you're trying to understand these activities, but without evaluation, an evaluative notion, without evaluative concepts in play, you haven't really got an account of why people are reasonable to pursue it, because they're pursuing things they take to be of value. And when they're enjoying things, and this really connects with the kinds of pleasures that involve, they're not just like simple pleasures, they're pleasures in which values are centrally part of the kind of pleasures they are. They're responses to a kind of value, for example. So you need, you can't get evaluation out of the theory of art in the way that people like Danto and Dickey and perhaps Levinson do. So one person who I think gets things deeply right here is my favourite philosopher, Plato, and so he thinks, he doesn't think the arts. Many of the arts he's talking about, the mimetic arts, have value, but he certainly, in trying to give an account of what they are and our activities with respect to them, you need to give an account of how they seem to have value. And so his theory is the right kind of theory. So you then theorize in the right way, and then you say, right, they appear to have value, but they don't really have it, so bye-bye artists. But it's the right kind of theory, as opposed to these kind of desiccated theories of art, where the value is nothing to do with it. So we need value right in the middle of art, and here. And someone who I think gets this right is Christy Maguire. I think I pronounced his name right in a book, Art and Art Attempts. You still do get textbooks. I can't believe it. I occasionally, if a new textbook in aesthetics comes out, I'll read them, and they say, aesthetic theories of art can't account for the existence of bad art. I just, duh. Yeah, so maybe art has an aesthetic function. It has a certain aesthetic aim. It doesn't mean that they always all succeed. That's just really obvious. I just don't understand why you keep getting that in textbooks. So there's dysfunctional art. So many artworks, not all, but many artworks have this kind of aesthetic function, and they can fail. So just like Ruth Millikan, who I'm a big fan of, her work in philosophy of mind, you can have a heart which fails, can't pump blood, but it's still a heart because that's its function. Similarly, there are artworks which have an aesthetic aim, but they might be bad works of art, and that's just built into the very bowels of the theory of an aesthetic theory of art. So I just don't understand these strange textbooks. Now, lastly, the last thing I really want to say is my approach is really this appeal to explanation and rational explanation, but there's a whole lot of explanations which don't get in the minds, as it were, of the participants in that way. They're non-rational explanations. There's brain science, there's evolutionary theory, there's what we might call the sort of naturalistic approach to aesthetics. And what about all these kinds of explanations, which so far I haven't really talked about? And you might think, well, why not? Why not talk about sociological evolutionary explanations, which aren't really ones from the point of view of the practitioners? Well, yeah. I don't want to be down on those kind of theories. I think they have a role to play. For example, in the kind of pleasures involved in perception, there's going to be all sorts of stuff that scientists in psychology can tell us, which will certainly cast light on our pleasures in things we perceive visually, for example. But I think there's also, you need to dovetail all that with the evaluative point of view. And you've got to watch out for people who want to give theories of which bypass the point of view of the practitioners. So in this, so for example, Georgia O'Keeffe, the very popular American artist, all sorts of people jumped on her artwork, Freudian psychologists, feminists and others, to give it a certain interpretation. And she was sort of heroic, I think, from giving them all the finger and saying, no, you're not going to give my works your interpretation. She stuck to her guns and wouldn't let them, as it were, hijack her work for their own purposes. So there's the point of view of practitioners is an important one. I think you can't ride roughshod over it. So you can engage in Freudian, evolutionary, brain scientific theories, but I think they should be functioning to supplement an explanation which makes sense of our interest in these activities from the point of view of the practitioners, people who produce it and consume it and perhaps sustain those artworks, preserve it as well. There's also works in, making sure the works don't deteriorate between production and consumption, and there's other players, but I suppose production and consumption are the most important players, where people have a conception of what they're doing, where they see a value in what they're doing, and that sort of evaluative perspective has to be there. And you can also have these other kinds of explanatory projects as part of the overall project of explaining what's going on, but they mustn't usurp the evaluative perspective, which is the point of view of the first person point of view of the people engaging with these artworks. So I've given you a pitch here pretty much in favor of being down on the traditional way of theorizing about art in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, and pursuing the concept of art as fundamental, and instead this sort of rational explanatory perspective is the one I'm proposing as one you might like to consider to take up. But the conceptual analysis and playing with intuitions and necessary and sufficient conditions, they still somehow exert a grip on philosophers, but they just are a dead end, and let's bury it deep. Okay, so that's the end. I've been crouching down there. That's Nick Zangwill in these beautiful gardens on this lockdown, these lockdown times, sending greetings to Portugal. And I hope to meet you all at some point. Please get in touch with me and email me if you want to engage with this, any of Victor's students. It's been a pleasure, I hope, and maybe we can engage some other way apart from so remotely after the end of these strange days.